Why is milk the fastest liquid on Earth?
Because it moves.
Because it's pasteurized before you even see it.
I don't get it.
Pasteurize?
Oh!
It's pasteurized before you even see it?
Yeah.
You like it?
Yeah.
Rolling forward, Dr. Sister Science Facts.
All right. Welcome to this week's episode of the Rolling Forward podcast.
I'm Dr. Alicia Rolin.
I'm Dr. Stephanie Rolin.
I'm a pediatrician.
I'm a psychiatrist.
We are researchers, we're clinicians, we're podcasters.
And we do this as a way of demystifying some of the health noise that's out there because it can get really loud. And this week, we're talking about milk.
Moo.
That kind of milk, yeah.
That kind of milk. I feel like this administration's had a lot of feelings about milk.
Honestly, I've not thought this much about milk with the exception of when we run out of milk for my coffee in the morning. That's the only time that I'm ever thinking about milk. But here we are.
So, talking about milk, because rules and messaging about milk has really been shifting. And it's left a lot of parents asking, wait, what's the healthiest milk now?
So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about what these rule changes are with milk. We're going to be talking about pasteurization, whole milk, skim milk, lactose-free milk, non-dairy milk, all the options you have out there. More about milk than you've ever wanted to know.
So let's get started.
Rolling forward, Dr. Sister Science Facts.
So let's start with what's changed in the rules around milk.
So, policy change. On January 14th, 2026, the Whole Milk for Healthy Kids Act of 2025 was signed into law.
Is it really the Act of 2025 signed in 2026?
That's correct. The law updates the milk standards used in the U.S. Department of Agriculture Nutritional School Lunch Program and School Breakfast Program.
Before we get into the changes, let's talk about what it was before. Before the Act of 2025, signed in 2026, schools had to offer only low-fat or fat-free milk to students. They were typically not permitted to offer either whole milk or 2% milk as part of reimbursable school meals.
Under the new law, schools are now allowed, not required, but allowed to offer whole milk and 2% milk alongside 1% and skim milk. So the key change here is an expanded choice, but it's not a mandate.
And there are two implementation details that really matter for how this is going to work in practice. First of all, the calculations around saturated fat. So the USDA offers a lot of guidance around how school lunches need to be structured. And we've talked about that in an earlier episode about school lunches. The USDA still has a weekly average limit on saturated fat across the entire school meal. But under the new guidance, saturated fat from fluid milk doesn't count towards weekly saturated fat calculation.
Fluid milk.
Just only fluid milk.
As compared to solid milk?
I mean, I guess as opposed to cheesecake. But in other words, what this means that if a school offers whole milk or 2% milk, that won't count towards their weekly saturated fat. So they will not fall out of compliance simply because they're actually offering more fat through milk, as long as the rest of the meal meets the standards. That seems confusing, but it's important because under the old rules, even a single higher fat item like milk could make an otherwise balanced meal non-compliant.
The second key change involves non-dairy milk substitutes. The updated guidance clarifies and broadens access to non-dairy milks, such as soy-based beverages, for students who cannot or do not consume dairy milk. In many cases, schools can now provide a non-dairy milk alternative simply with a parent or guardian request, rather than requiring formal medical documentation.
But, and this is critical, although schools can now offer this non-dairy alternative with less restrictions, the non-dairy substitute that is offered in place of milk must be nutritionally equivalent to fluid cow's milk. Again, fluid milk. I never really thought about the different states of milk. I guess
Gaseous milk.
Solid milk, okay, ice cream, and fluid milk. Here we are. So basically, if a school is offering a non-dairy substitute, it still needs to meet the same standards for nutrients like protein, calcium, vitamin D, and other key micronutrients as fluid milk. So it's not a free-for-all where you can give any plant-based beverage that you'd like.
And so putting this all together, the policy shift is not about declaring one type of milk better than another. It's about flexibility in implementation. So schools now have more flexibility in milk fat options and a more standard, clear pathway for offering nutritionally equivalent non-dairy milk alternatives.
So now to make sense of this, we're going to separate 3 milk questions that often get mixed together. And honestly, I didn't know we were going to be focusing so much on milk this year, but it's true that these questions come up a lot and that people will sometimes conflate them. So we'll take these one at a time. The first question is going to be pasteurized versus raw. And spoiler, this is mostly a safety question. The second is going to be whole versus low-fat dairy, which is going to be focused on the cardiometabolic and nutrition patterns. And the third is going to be about dairy versus non-dairy milks, and that's going to be about nutrient equivalence. And the evidence around these questions, they're not all the same. So let's tackle them one at a time.
Starting with the strongest evidence.
I know you love this topic. Raw milk. Tell me.
If you take one thing from this episode, let it be this. Pasteurization is one of the most successful public health interventions in modern food safety.
What? Yes, I will.
I mean, you can't disagree with that.
No, a strong cosign, because that's not rhetoric. That's microbiology. Pasteurization refers to a controlled heat process that is designed specifically to kill disease-causing microorganisms in milk without meaningfully degrading its nutritional value.
And that's why agencies like the Center for Disease Control and Prevention and the Food and Drug Administration are very direct on this point. Pasteurization kills harmful disease with minimal impact on milk's nutritional quality, while raw milk carries a substantially higher risk of foodborne illness.
And if we need to talk about this in more detail, we can, because we can talk about why raw milk is riskier. Cows carry bacteria like Salmonella, Campylobacter, E. coli, and Listeria, and they have these without appearing sick. So these organisms can enter milk during the milking process, even under clean conditions.
And pasteurization interrupts that transmission.
And this isn't a historical risk. This is something that's happening right now because people are continuing to consume raw milk. And so for any parents listening, children especially are vulnerable to exposure to these illnesses because they're not just small adults. They're much more vulnerable to dehydration, kidney injury, and neurological complications when exposed to something infectious like E. coli. So while you'll sometimes hear claims that raw milk is more nutritious or better for immunity, when you look at the scientific testing of those claims, they don't hold up because pasteurization causes minimal losses of heat-sensitive vitamins, and those losses are nutritionally insignificant when you compare it to the very real safety risks of consuming raw milk. And that's why, in any conversation about healthy milk choices, the clearest recommendation we have is to choose pasteurized milk and pasteurized dairy products. Do not choose that raw milk, raw chicken smoothie, because it's not even a close call in the evidence. It's the foundation that everything else builds on.
Okay. Question number 1. Check. Pasteurized milk.
Now, question number 2.
Do we go for the whole or the low-fat pasteurized option?
Now, this is a question that people really tend to argue about. Should we do whole milk, 2%, 1% skim milk? What should we do?
To understand why this is controversial, we need to slow down and explain the biology. Saturated fat is a type of dietary fat that's solid at room temperature and found in foods like butter, cheese, red meat, and whole-fat dairy. When we eat saturated fat, it affects how the liver processes cholesterol.
Specifically, higher saturated fat intake leads the liver to produce and circulate more of something called LDL cholesterol, sometimes referred to as bad cholesterol. And when LDL levels are high over time, cholesterol will be deposited into blood vessel walls, which causes atherosclerosis. This is a process that underlies heart attacks and strokes later in life.
This relationship, saturated fat leading to higher LDL, which leads to cardiovascular disease risk, is one of the most well-established findings in nutrition and cardiovascular science. It's why organizations like the American Heart Association and the Center for Disease Control and Prevention have long recommended limiting the amount of saturated fat in your diet.
And what's important to note is that while some policies have changed around milk, the biology has not changed. It is stable. What has changed is how we're talking about the impact of milk fat specifically for children within real-world diets.
So over the last decade, researchers started asking a more precise question. Does drinking whole milk as opposed to lower fat milk, actually lead to worsened health outcomes in kids.
One of the most cited pediatric summaries addressing this found that children who consumed whole milk had lower odds of being overweight or obese compared to those who consumed reduced fat milk. But this is where scientific humility matters, because the authors of that were very clear about the limitations. All of these studies were observational, and observational studies, they cannot reliably establish cause and effect.
And there are several plausible reasons why whole milk drinkers might appear leaner in observational data that has nothing to do with milk fat being protective. For example, parents might switch to a low-fat milk after their children are overweight. Families choosing low-fat milk may differ in income, education, or overall diet quality. Or whole milk may increase satiety for some children, changing eating patterns in a way that aren't captured well in studies.
And there's another key point that often gets missed. Weight and cardiovascular risk are not the same thing. A child can have a normal body weight and still have higher LDL cholesterol if their overall saturated fat intake is high. Conversely, a child can be heavier for reasons that are unrelated to milk fat.
So when scientists look at cardiometabolic markers like LDL cholesterol, the evidence still supports limiting saturated fats overall.
Which leads us to these evidence-based honest conclusions. We cannot say that whole milk causes obesity in children, and we can also not say that whole milk is inherently better or protective. We don't know.
What we can say is that the milk fat percentage is one variable within a larger dietary pattern that determines saturated fat intake, LDL cholesterol, and long-term cardiovascular risk.
And that broader dietary pattern includes total saturated fat from all foods, fiber intake, added sugar, overall calorie balance, physical activity, and a child's growth trajectory.
Which is exactly why a health policy can reasonably allow flexibility in school milk fat options while still maintaining overall saturated fat guidance at the meal or diet level.
So this policy change about allowing schools to offer 2% or whole milk, it is not a rejection of decades of cardiovascular science. The science does not change. It reflects some of the scientific uncertainty that we currently have.
So if you're listening to all this and thinking, okay, I can handle nuance about saturated fat, LDL cholesterol, and dietary patterns, but my kid just gets stomach aches when they drink milk. Congratulations, you're now entering question number 3.
Question number 3, where we say, not all milk problems are philosophical, some are just gastrointestinal. The question of lactose.
Lactose is not my friend.
Lactose. It's not many people's friend.
Lactose intolerance is really common, and it becomes more common as you age. So if you did really well with milk as an adolescent and now you've hit your 30s and you do less well with milk, welcome.
Welcome to your 30s, because globally, most humans do lose some lactase activity as they age. And in the US, lactose intolerance is particularly prevalent among people of East Asian, African, Hispanic, Latino, and indigenous ancestry.
Lactose intolerance happens when the small intestine doesn't make enough lactase. This is an enzyme that breaks down lactose, which is the natural sugar in milk.
And when you don't break down lactose, it travels to the colon where gut bacteria ferment it. And that's when people start to experience things like bloating, gas, abdominal pain, and diarrhea.
And here's a really important clarification that we make all the time in pediatrics. Lactose intolerance is not the same as a milk allergy.
I've heard that. Could you explain that?
A milk allergy is an immune system reaction, usually to milk proteins like casein or whey. It causes hives, vomiting, wheezing, swelling, or even anaphylaxis. Milk allergy is most common in infants and young children, and it requires strict avoidance of dairy.
And contrasting that to lactose intolerance, which is not immune-mediated, it's dose-dependent, and it doesn't mean that milk is dangerous. It just means lactose isn't being digested well.
It just gives you some grumbly tummies.
And so, for some people, there's a very practical and sometimes underappreciated solution: lactose-free cow's milk.
Lactose-free milk is regular cow's milk with just that lactase enzyme that you're missing added directly into the milk.
And that lactase works to break down lactose into glucose and galactose before you drink it. So then your gut doesn't have to do the work.
So nutritionally, lactose-free milk is essentially identical to regular milk. It has the same protein, the same calcium, the same vitamins, the same iodine. Nothing important is removed.
Now, if you have some lactose-free milk, you might notice it tastes a little sweeter. And that's because the lactase that was added broke the lactose into glucose and galactose, and they taste sweeter than lactose. No sugar has actually been added.
And clinically, this matters a lot because if your child can't tolerate lactose but does fine with lactose-free dairy, this often simplifies nutrition dramatically. You can keep the protein and the micronutrients without redesigning your entire diet.
And that matters because there is so much that kids get from dairy, and it can be harder to replace when you start to eliminate dairy entirely.
So here's the clear takeaway before we move on to milk alternatives. Lactose intolerance is not the same as a milk allergy. The milk allergy is an immune-driven reaction, and the response is that kids have to avoid dairy. While lactose intolerance is an enzyme issue, and that lactose-free dairy often solves the problem. Now, say you do have a milk allergy, and you have to avoid dairy.
Well, we have so many new plant milks.
Here's the key science behind these alternative milks. They are not automatically nutritionally equivalent to cow's milk.
Because some of these non-dairy milks have lower fat and carbs, and some have a lot more fat and carbs than milk. So they're each different.
In general, a cup of cow's milk has about 8 grams of protein per cup. Many alternative milks like almond, oat, rice milks are much lower in protein unless they're formulated differently. And that brings us to fortified soy milk. Fortified soy milk is a milk that often can be a good substitute for cow's milk.
For school and federal meal programs, the equivalence to milk isn't optional. The USDA policy says it must be nutritionally equivalent. So, a parent-friendly rule: if you're using plant milk as a beverage for taste, that's fine. But if you're starting to use it as a nutritional substitute, be sure to check how much protein is in that milk, look at the calcium and vitamin D fortification, and see whether there's any added sugar so that you can have a sense of how this ranks compared to milk. So let's wrap up all this talk about milk. We've talked about a lot of different things: pasteurization, whole milk, 2%, non-dairy, lactose. Let's end by providing a simple, evidence-based guide for people who are making decisions around milk.
Step 1. Safety. Choose pasteurized milk and pasteurized dairy products.
Step 2, choose the milk fat level that's right for your family based on the whole diet. Whole milk can fit well for kids who need more calories, are very active, or struggle with picky eating, especially when the rest of their diet isn't heavy in saturated fats. But low-fat milk could be helpful when the overall saturated fat intake is already high.
Step 3. If you have lactose intolerant, you can consider using lactose-free dairy milk. It has the same nutritional components as cow's milk.
And then step 4, for non-dairy milk, if you want a close nutritional substitute to milk, fortified soy tends to be the closest match. Otherwise, plan your protein elsewhere and look for unsweetened fortified options.
And that's our episode for today. Milk policy is changing, but the science message is calmer than the internet makes it seem.
Rolling forward, Dr. Sister Science Facts.
That's it for today, and we'll see you next time on the Rolin Forward podcast. I'm Dr. Stephanie Rolin.
I'm Dr. Alicia Rolin.
You can find us on social media. Send us an email at RolinForwardShow. That's ROLIN forward show @gmail.com.
If you like this episode, give us a 5-star review.
And share it with a friend. Thank you for tuning in, and good luck with these milk choices.
It's time for some cheese.
Oh, time for some cheese.
Rolling forward, Dr. Sister Science Facts.
Da-da-da, rolling forward, sister science.
Yes.